Or medieval queens, just dainty figures in gowns waiting to be rescued? Think again. Their lives were often brutal battles for survival, packed with desperate gambles and narrow escapes that would make your jaw drop. From icy fortresses to treacherous river journeys, these queens faced down their enemies and often emerged victorious. Get ready to dive into the heart-pounding stories of 9 women who cheated fate in the most astounding ways, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon a queen possessed was her sheer will to live, set against the backdrop of Europe's turbulent past, from the 10th century to the 16th century. Number 9. The Berengaria of Castile. Betrayal break. The year was 1217. In the kingdom of Castile, the air thrummed with unspoken threats, a silent danger that coiled around the young Queen Berengaria. She was no stranger to political storms. Her marriage to King Alfonso IX of Leon had been a union steeped in controversy, annulled by the Pope due to consanguinity, their shared ancestry. Despite the annulment, they had continued to live together, raising their children, building a fragile peace between their kingdoms. But peace, especially in medieval Iberia, was a fleeting dream, easily shattered by ambition and shifting loyalties. Berengaria's estranged husband, Alfonso, grew increasingly jealous of her influence, her growing power as regent for her young son Ferdinand. He was wary of her family in Castile, and her intelligence often grated against his own pride. Berengaria, a woman of sharp intellect and formidable political instincts, knew her position was precarious. She had spent years mastering the intricate dance of medieval power, understanding that a crown offered little protection against the poisoned chalice of court intrigue or the swift blade of betrayal. Her greatest treasure. Her children were also her greatest vulnerability. They were the future of Castile and thus targets. King Alfonso, despite being their father, was increasingly seen as a threat, his erratic temper and desire to control their destiny growing more pronounced with each passing day. He wanted Ferdinand to be his heir in Leon, perhaps even at the cost of his Castilian inheritance, a notion that chilled Berengaria to her bones. The breaking point arrived with a chilling suddenness. Berengaria received word, a whispered warning carried by loyal servants, that King Alfonso was planning a sinister move. He intended to seize their children, her precious Ferdinand and his siblings, and carry them off to Leon. There he would hold them, ostensibly under his protection, but in reality as hostages. He would indoctrinate them, turn them against their mother, and perhaps even declare them his heirs in Leon, effectively disinheriting them from their rightful place. In Castile, this was not just a threat to her children's safety, but to the very future of the Castilian crown and everything Berengaria had fought to preserve. There was no time for elaborate plans, no luxury of a grand strategy. The danger was imminent. The castle gates could close at any moment, trapping her and her children in a gilded cage. Berengaria's decision was swift, born of a mother's fierce love and a queen's iron will. She would not wait for Alfonso's soldiers to arrive. She would not allow her children to become pawns in his cruel game. She would escape, and she would take her children with her no matter the cost. Under the cloak of deepest night, a small desperate party began to stir within the castle walls. Berengaria, with the help of a handful of trusted ladies and loyal knights, moved with a quiet urgency. Her children, still innocent, were bundled quickly from their beds, confused, but sensing the gravity of the moment through their mother's hushed commands. Young Ferdinand, barely a teenager, was old enough to understand the danger, his small face etched with a mixture of fear and determination as he clung to his mother's hand. They could not afford to be seen. Castle guards, even those who might sympathize with Berengaria, were ultimately loyal to the king, or at least bound by duty. Every shadow was a potential witness, every creaking floorboard a betraying sound. They moved through hidden passages, down service stairs, usually reserved for servants, their footsteps muffled by thick cloaks. The air was cold, damp with the chill of an early morning, and the darkness was absolute. Save for the flickering glow of a single lantern held low by a trembling hand. Their path led them to a seldom used postern gate, a small, inconspicuous exit in the outer walls, usually barred and secured, but Berengaria, ever resourceful, had cultivated allies. A sympathetic guard, his face a mask of apprehension, stood ready. He had received his instructions earlier in the day, a coded message, and now, with a furtive glance around, he quietly unbarred the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning softly in protest. A sliver of pre-dawn light cut through the darkness, offering a glimpse of the freedom that lay beyond. Outside, a small escort of loyal knights waited, their horses saddled and ready, their faces grim and determined. These were men who owed their allegiance not just to the crown but to Berengaria herself. Recognizing her strength and wisdom, they mounted quickly, Berengaria securing her youngest children before swinging herself into her own saddle. The ride was treacherous. They avoided main roads, sticking to ancient winding paths known only to local peasants and experienced riders. The terrain was uneven, the darkness still heavy, and the constant threat of discovery hung over them like a shroud. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant dog's bark, sent a fresh wave of panic through the small group. They pressed on, riding through forests where trees loomed like silent sentinels, over rocky hills that tested the stamina of their horses, and across shallow rivers that chilled them to the bone. Berengaria, despite the physical discomfort and gnawing anxiety, maintained a steely composure. Her resolve was absolute. Their destination was the castle of Austell, a stronghold loyal to her family in Castile, a sanctuary where she knew they would be safe. It was a long, arduous journey made even more difficult by the need for secrecy and haste. They rode for hours without rest, the sun eventually rising to warm their chilled bodies, but also to expose them. They kept to the shadows, pausing only briefly to rest their horses and allow the children a moment of respite, their hunger gnawing at them, but their mother's determination urging them forward. As the sun began to set on their second day of desperate flight, the towers of Austell finally appeared on the horizon, a welcome sight that brought tears to Berengaria's eyes and a collective sigh of relief from her weary companions. News of their escape reached King Alfonso swiftly, igniting his fury. He dispatched riders, but they found only empty castle rooms and the lingering scent of desperation. Berengaria's swift action had thwarted him, securing her children's safety and, more importantly, protecting their rightful claim to the throne of Castile. This daring flight was not merely an escape from physical captivity, but a strategic maneuver, a desperate gamble that paid off. It cemented Berengaria's reputation as a queen of unparalleled resilience and foresight, a woman who would risk everything to safeguard her lineage and her kingdom. Her escape ensured the continued rule of her son Ferdinand III, who would go on to become one of Castile's most celebrated monarchs, Ferdinand the Saint. Without Berengaria's courageous and rapid flight, the very course of Spanish history might have been irrevocably altered. Number 8. The Constance of Sicily crowned capture. The year was 1194, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty plains of southern Italy. Queen Constance of Sicily, a woman of 40 and pregnant, was on a precarious journey. Her husband, Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, was away, leading his armies to conquer the Kingdom of Sicily. Constance's ancestral home. She was journeying to meet him, a queen joining her triumphant husband, yet her path was fraught with danger. The Norman nobility of Sicily, fierce and independent, resented Henry's German rule and saw Constance, a native Sicilian, as their last hope. Her very presence in the kingdom was a lightning rod for rebellious sentiment. Constance, a descendant of the formidable Norman kings of Sicily, was the last legitimate heir to a kingdom coveted by powerful European dynasties. Her marriage to Henry VI was meant to unite the Holy Roman Empire with Sicily, forging a formidable power block. However, Her claim was fiercely contested by local nobles who favored a more independent ruler, Tancred of Lecce, or his young son, William III. The political landscape was a minefield, each step a gamble. Constance was pregnant with her first and only child, the future Frederick II, a fact that added a layer of vulnerability and immense importance to her survival. As Constance progressed through the treacherous territories, the local population was far from welcoming. Whispers of rebellion followed her, and the loyalty of the towns she passed through was tenuous at best. The air was thick with resentment towards the German imperial forces that were slowly encroaching on Sicilian independence. This was not a friendly visit. It was a military occupation, and Constance, despite her Sicilian blood, was seen as part of the invading force. Then disaster struck with chilling precision. Near Salerno, a coastal city with a strong anti-German sentiment, Constance's small retinue was ambushed. The citizens of Salerno, fueled by local noble factions and a deep-seated desire to resist Henry's conquest, rose up. Constance, despite being pregnant and surrounded by only a small guard, found herself abruptly seized. She was no longer a queen on a royal procession, but a prisoner caught in the crossfire of a brutal dynastic struggle. Her captors were led by a powerful Salernitan noble, a man named Miraculous of Brindisi, a formidable admiral and staunch opponent of German rule. He saw Constance as a valuable bargaining chip, a prize that could be used to leverage concessions from Henry VI, or perhaps even undermine his claim to Sicily. Entirely, the capture was humiliating and dangerous. A pregnant queen, an empress to be held captive by her own people. Constance was imprisoned in a castle, its stone walls cold and unyielding. Conditions of her captivity are not precisely known, but it would have been designed to isolate her, to break her spirit, and to control her movements entirely. For a woman of her standing, used to luxury and authority, such an abrupt shift to imprisonment, especially while in her delicate state, would have been profoundly harrowing. The fear for her unborn child must have been immense. The future of her dynasty, of Sicily itself, rested on her shoulders, and now she was trapped. However, Henry VI was not a king to be trifled with. News of his wife's capture infuriated him. He had just successfully seized Palermo, the capital of Sicily, and was consolidating his control over the island. He immediately brought immense pressure to bear on Margaritas and the rebellious Salernitans. He threatened brutal reprisals, promising to raze Salerno to the ground and execute anyone involved in the queen's abduction. His army was powerful, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him. The situation was a stalemate. Margaritas held the queen, but Henry held the kingdom. The Pope, Celestine III, also weighed in. He recognized the immense political implications of Constance's captivity, and fearing the wrath of the emperor, and desiring to maintain a semblance of peace, he intervened. Pope demanded Constance's release, appealing to Margaritas and the Salernitans to avoid further bloodshed and escalating conflict. Under such immense pressure, Margaritas and the Salernitan rebels realized they had overplayed their hand. Holding the empress was proving to be more of a liability than an asset. The threats from Henry VI were credible, and the Pope's intervention added a moral and political weight they could not ignore. The risk of Henry's vengeance outweighed any potential gain from their captive. Reluctantly, they began negotiations for her release. The details of these negotiations are scant, but the outcome was clear. Constance was to be handed over to papal custody, a compromise that avoided direct capitulation to Henry but ensured her safety. She was not directly rescued by Henry's forces in a daring raid, but rather released through a complex web of political pressure, military threat, and papal intervention. It was a diplomatic triumph for Henry, and a miraculous escape for Constance from a potentially deadly predicament. Her transfer from Salernitan custody to papal care marked the end of her direct imprisonment. From there, she was eventually reunited with her husband. This escape was not a dramatic flight over walls or through secret tunnels, but a meticulous navigation of dangerous political waters while in a deeply vulnerable state. It was an escape from a situation where she could have been killed, used as a perpetual pawn, or even miscarried her vital heir. She escaped the immediate physical danger and the looming threat of prolonged, debilitating captivity. Soon after her release and reunion with Henry, Constance gave birth to Frederick II in Jesi, a momentous event that secured the Hohenstaufen dynasty's claim to Sicily. Her capture and release became a footnote in the grander narrative of Henry's conquest. But for Constance, it was a harrowing episode of survival, a testament to her resilience in the face of brutal political realities. She had escaped from a perilous situation, ensuring the birth of an heir who would profoundly shape European history, an heir whose existence was threatened by her temporary captivity. Her escape was a victory not just for her personal freedom, but for the future of her dynasty and the powerful lineage she represented. Number 7. The Joanna I of Naples, Mediterranean Maraud. The year was 1345, and the city of Naples, usually a vibrant hub of Mediterranean life, was steeped in tragedy and fear. Queen Joanna I of Naples, a mere 18 years old, found herself at the epicenter of a horrific scandal. Her husband, Andrew of Hungary, had been brutally murdered in their bedchamber in Aversa. Suspicion, like a venomous serpent, immediately coiled around Joanna. The Neapolitan court, a nest of vipers, whispered accusations of her complicity of a love affair, of a desperate desire to rid herself of a husband she disliked, and who was often a hindrance to her rule. Andrew's murder was a clear act of regicide, an affront to royal authority. Whether she was truly involved or not, the perception of her guilt was widespread, amplified by the fierce resentment of Andrew's powerful Hungarian family. His brother Louis I of Hungary, known as Louis the Great, swore vengeance, publicly accusing Joanna and demanding her punishment. He threatened to invade Naples, to tear down her kingdom and bring her to justice for her alleged role in Andrew's death. The Neapolitan nobles, always eager to exploit a moment of weakness, began to shift their loyalties, some openly siding with the Hungarian cause, others simply waiting to see which way the wind blew. Joanna, young and inexperienced, faced a court crumbling around her, her authority undermined by suspicion and the terrifying prospect of a vengeful Hungarian army descending upon her kingdom. The atmosphere was thick with betrayal whispers and the palpable fear of war. As Louis of Hungary began to marshal his forces, Joanna's situation became untenable. Her attempts to prove her innocence, to hold trials for the accused, were viewed with skepticism. The Hungarians rejected her explanations, seeing them as flimsy excuses. Louis was resolute. He would come to Naples, and he would punish those responsible, with Joanna at the top of his list. Recognizing the imminent danger, Joanna's most loyal advisors urged her to flee. Staying in Naples meant certain capture, humiliation, and perhaps even death at the hands of the Hungarians. The city itself, so easily captured by a determined army, offered no real refuge. Her only hope was to escape, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the approaching Hungarian forces. Her plan was simple. In its desperation, escape by sea. The sea, often a highway for trade and communication, also offered a potential avenue for flight, a fluid border that land armies could not easily cross. But the sea was also unpredictable, and her journey would be fraught with its own set of dangers. She needed to reach her ancestral lands in Provence, across the Mediterranean, a journey that would be long and perilous. Under cover of darkness in late 1345 or early 1346, Joanna and her small retinue slipped out of Naples. They moved with utmost secrecy, avoiding the watchful eyes of any potential traitors or Hungarian sympathizers who might report their movements. Port was their destination, a place where ships lay anchored waiting for dawn. Securing a vessel proved to be a covert operation in itself, relying on the loyalty of a few trusted captains and merchants who were willing to risk the emperor's wrath for their queen. They boarded a galley, a sleek ship propelled by oars, and a single sail. The departure was hushed, the splashing of oars and the creaking of timber, the only sounds breaking the silence of the night. The city lights of Naples slowly receded behind them, swallowed by the vast dark expanse of the Mediterranean. Joanna, likely dressed in simple clothing to avoid recognition, must have felt a profound mix of relief and terror. She was free from the immediate threat of capture, but sailing into an uncertain future. The voyage itself was far from easy. Medieval sea travel was arduous and unpredictable. Storms could appear without warning, pirate ships roamed the waters, and fresh water and supplies were always a concern. For a queen, accustomed to the luxuries of court, the cramped quarters of a galley, the constant rocking of the waves, and the fear of discovery, would have been a grueling experience. They had to sail clear of any Humbrian patrols or allied fleets that might be lurking. Their journey was a race against time, a desperate dash to reach the safe harbor of Provence before Louis of Hungary could close in on Naples. Every day at sea was a day of freedom gained, a day further from the reach of her vengeful brother-in-law. The sun beat down, the wind whipped across the decks, and the waves crashed against the hull, each motion a reminder of their vulnerable state. Finally, after a perilous journey across the open sea, the shores of Provence appeared on the horizon. The sight must have been a beacon of hope for Joanna and her exhausted companions. They had made it. They had cheated Louis's immediate grasp. Joanna's arrival in Provence, while a successful escape, was not an end to her troubles. She had to rebuild her reputation, appeal to the Pope, who resided in Avignon, also in Provence, and gather support for her cause. Her escape bought her precious time, allowing her to put her case before the papal court and to secure allies. The fact that she was able to flee Naples and survive the dangerous sea journey to Provence, avoiding capture and potential execution by the vengeful Hungarian king, was a testament to her courage and the loyalty of her remaining supporters. Her flight ensured her survival and allowed her to eventually return to Naples, albeit after years of conflict. This desperate escape, driven by the immediate threat of a powerful invading army and the shadow of a grave accusation, was a monumental act of survival, a queen betting everything on a daring flight across the waves to escape her grim fate. Number 6. The Eleanor of Provence-Thames tumult. The year was 1263, and London was a cauldron of rebellion. Queen Eleanor of Provence, wife of King Henry III, found herself trapped in the Tower of London, a seemingly impregnable fortress, but one that was now a cage. The city outside seethed with hostility towards her and her husband, who were seen as incompetent and overly reliant on foreign advisors, many of whom were Eleanor's own relatives from Savoy. The English barons, led by the formidable Simon de Montfort, had risen in revolt, demanding reforms and limits on royal power. Eleanor was no stranger to political strife. For years, she had been a lightning rod for discontent. Her strong will, her financial acumen, which often involved collecting taxes and duties, and her patronage of foreign courtiers, had made her deeply unpopular with the Londoners. They resented her influence over the king and the perceived extravagance of the royal court. The city, normally a source of support for the monarchy, was now a hotbed of anti-royalist sentiment, particularly directed at the Queen. The situation in London deteriorated rapidly. The city gates were controlled by Montfort's allies, and the streets were patrolled by angry mobs. Tower of London, though strategically located, was essentially under siege from within the city walls. Eleanor, along with her children and a small loyal retinue, was effectively prisoners cut off from the outside world and from her husband, who was also facing intense pressure from the rebels. Eleanor was a woman of spirit and determination, not one to simply await her fate. She knew that remaining in the tower was unsustainable. She needed to escape, to rejoin her husband, to rally support, and to contribute to the royalist cause. The immediate danger was not just imprisonment, but the palpable threat of mob violence. The Londoners hated her, and if the tower fell, or if she were to be paraded through the streets, her life would be in grave peril. Her plan, born of desperation and courage, was simple: escape by river. The River Thames, the lifeblood of London, flowed directly past the tower walls. It offered a potential conduit to freedom. a watery pathway out of the hostile city. But the river itself presented its own set of dangers. It was a busy thoroughfare, and more importantly, its banks were lined with angry citizens, and its waters patrolled by those loyal to the rebel cause. On a warm July day, Eleanor put her audacious plan into motion. She gathered a small group of trusted companions, including her ladies-in-waiting and a few knights, and stealthily made their way to a secluded wharf within the tower complex. A royal barge, usually a symbol of majesty and power, waited for them, its oars ready to propel them towards safety. As they pushed off from the bank, the plan began to unravel almost immediately. The sight of the royal barge, clearly identifiable, stirred the already agitated crowds gathered along the riverbanks. The news of the Queen's attempted escape spread like wildfire. A roar of fury erupted from the Londoners. They recognized her. They despised her. The river, usually a means of swift passage, became a gauntlet. From both banks, the mob hurled insults, curses, and anything they could lay their hands on. Stones, rotten vegetables, mud, and even human excrement. The air filled with a cacophony of shouts and jeers, a chilling sound of popular rage directed solely at the Queen. The barge, once a vessel of escape, became a target battered by the projectiles and the sheer force of the people's hatred. Eleanor, enduring the torrent of abuse, sat bravely, refusing to show fear, though her heart must have pounded in her chest. Her small group of guards tried to shield her, but they were few, and the crowd was fast and enraged. The oarsmen struggled to maintain control of the barge as it was buffeted by the improvised missiles, and the waves churned up by smaller boats attempting to intercept them. It became terrifyingly clear that they could not proceed. The river was too dangerous, the mob too determined. Continuing meant certain capture, or worse, being overwhelmed and dragged from the barge into the furious crowd. There was no way through. With a heavy heart, Eleanor ordered the barge to turn back. The humiliating retreat was as perilous as the attempt to escape. They had to navigate back through the hail of abuse and projectiles under the relentless gaze of the hostile Londoners. The journey back to the Tower of London must have felt like a journey to a deeper prison. She and her companions eventually made it back, shaken and humiliated, but crucially, alive. Her escape attempt had failed, but her courage in making the attempt was undeniable. She had stared directly into the face of mob violence and survived. This failed escape, though not leading to freedom, is considered miraculous because of the sheer personal courage it required to face such an enraged populace, and the fact that she and her companions were not captured, harmed, or even killed during the ordeal. She narrowly avoided a far worse fate than continued imprisonment in the tower. The very act of attempting it and surviving the barrage highlights her resilience. Eleanor would remain in the tower until the Battle of Lewes the following year, when Montfort defeated and captured Henry III. Only then was she allowed to leave. Her attempt to escape the Thames was a stark reminder of the deep divisions plaguing England and the personal dangers faced by its royal family during the tumultuous period of the Barons' War. Her survival of this public ordeal, despite the failure of her escape, was a testament to her remarkable fortitude. Number 5. The Isabella of France, Continental Covert. The year was 1325, and Queen Isabella of France, wife of King Edward II of England, found herself trapped in a marriage that had become a gilded cage. Edward's favoritism towards his male companions, particularly Hugh Despenser the Younger, had alienated almost everyone, especially his queen. Isabella, a strong-willed woman, felt increasingly marginalized and threatened by Despenser's growing influence, which extended even to controlling access to the king and royal finances. Her own children were being treated as pawns, their future uncertain. Edward II's reign was plagued by unpopularity, military failures in Scotland, and the constant threat of baronial revolt. Isabella, once a celebrated beauty and a symbol of Anglo-French alliance, was now effectively a prisoner at court, constantly under the watchful eye of Despenser and his allies. She was deprived of funds, separated from her children, and subjected to public humiliation. The atmosphere was stifling, dangerous, and unsustainable. The breaking point arrived when Isabella was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother King Charles IV regarding the disputed territory of Aquitaine. This was her chance, a golden opportunity to escape the toxic clutches of Edward and Despenser. She knew that returning to England meant facing continued degradation and potential harm. Her son, the young Prince Edward, was also in France, having been sent by his father to pay homage to Charles. This meant Isabella had her heir with her, a crucial element for any future political maneuver. Isabella, with the intelligence and ruthlessness that would later earn her the moniker She-Wolf of France, had no intention of returning to England on Edward's terms. Her escape would not be a dramatic flight from a dungeon, but a calculated high-stakes political defection. She had to secure her safety, protect her son, and find allies willing to challenge the entrenched power of Edward and Despenser. Plan involved remaining in France and building a coalition against her husband. This was a dangerous game. She was still a queen, but a queen in exile, reliant on the good graces of her brother and the willingness of powerful lords to risk everything for her cause. She needed money, troops, and above all, legitimacy. Once in France, Isabella refused to return to England, citing fears for her life and the safety of her son. She made her grievances public, appealing to her brother Charles IV and to the wider European nobility. This was a direct defiance of her husband, a public severing of ties that would have enormous consequences. The stakes were incredibly high. If her brother sided with Edward, or if she failed to find allies, she would be left stateless, powerless, and utterly vulnerable. Her most crucial move was to forge an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had been exiled by Edward and was also living in France. Mortimer was ambitious, ruthless, and shared Isabella's burning hatred for Despenser. Their alliance, quickly blossoming into a personal relationship, provided Isabella with the military and political muscle she desperately needed. Together, they began to plot Edward's overthrow. Isabella's escape to France allowed her to act independently, free from the constant surveillance and suppression of Edward and Despenser. She leveraged her royal lineage and her personal charm to gain support. She secured loans from sympathetic bankers and nobles, began recruiting mercenaries, and rallied disgruntled English exiles to her cause. Her charisma and determination drew many to her banner. The very act of staying in France was a defiance, a risky gamble that Edward could have easily counteracted if he had the support. But Edward's popularity had plummeted, and his warnings to Charles IV went unheeded. Charles, perhaps seeing an opportunity to destabilize his sister's husband, offered lukewarm support, allowing Isabella to continue her plotting. The escape culminated in the invasion of England in September 1326. Isabella Mortimer and their small but determined army landed in Suffolk. They were met not with resistance but with widespread public support. Edward II and Despenser found themselves abandoned by almost everyone. Their regime collapsed swiftly, and Edward was eventually captured and later brutally murdered, likely on Mortimer's orders. Isabella's escape was not a single dramatic moment of physical flight from a prison, but a sustained act of defiance, and a strategic flight from a political prison. It was a miraculous escape from a suffocating, life-threatening situation, where her power was stripped away and her future uncertain. By leaving England and leveraging her connections and her son's legitimacy, she completely inverted the power dynamic, transforming herself from a trapped queen into a conquering force. Her ability to gather support, evade Edward's attempts to force her return, and ultimately lead an invasion was a testament to her cunning and resilience. Her escape from the confines of her marriage and the oppressive court of Edward II fundamentally reshaped the course of English history, leading to the deposition of a king and a new, albeit Conchbella and Mortimer of Regency under Isabella and Mortimer. Number 4. The Margaret of Anjou, Hexham Hideaway. The year was 1464, and the Wars of the Roses raged across England, a brutal dynastic struggle for the throne. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the formidable and determined wife of the Lancastrian King Henry VI, found herself in an increasingly desperate situation. Her husband was weak, often mentally incapacitated, and her young son, Prince Edward, was the last hope for the House of Lancaster. But their cause was faltering constantly, battling the rising power of the House of York, led by the monarch Edward IV. Margaret was a warrior queen, a figure of unwavering resolve, who had personally led armies, negotiated alliances, and faced down her enemies with a ferocity that earned her both respect and fear. But even her formidable spirit was being tested to its limits. The Lancastrians had suffered a series of devastating defeats, and their resources were dwindling. The Battle of Hexham, fought in May 1464, was a crushing blow. The Yorkists under Lord Montague decisively defeated the Lancastrian forces. Many of Margaret's most loyal commanders were captured and swiftly executed. The Lancastrian army was shattered, their hopes seemingly extinguished. Margaret, along with her young son, was present near the battlefield, and the defeat meant immediate mortal danger. They were hunted with Edward IV, determined to capture the Queen and end the Lancastrian threat once and for all. Margaret's immediate priority was to ensure her son's safety. He was the future of their house, and if he fell into Yorkist hands, their cause was lost. There was no time for elaborate plans, no luxury of a prepared escape route. It was a desperate flight for survival through hostile territory. With a handful of loyal followers, including a young knight named John Fortescue and a few household servants, Margaret and her son fled the battlefield. They plunged into the vast, unforgiving depths of Northumberland, a region known for its wild, untamed landscapes and its sparse, often lawless population. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence of the forest was broken only by their hurried footsteps and the pounding of their hearts. The pursuit would have been relentless. Yorkist scouts and detachments would have fanned out searching for the Queen and her prince, knowing their capture would be the ultimate prize. Margaret and her small group had to move swiftly, keeping to the deepest shadows and the most obscure paths. Every rustle in the undergrowth, a potential enemy. Every distant sound, a sign of impending doom. As they navigated the dense forest, hunger and exhaustion began to take their toll. The terrain was challenging, filled with hidden ravines, thorny bushes, and muddy tracks. They had little food, and the chill of the northern English night began to set in. Margaret, a queen accustomed to comfort, was now a fugitive, stripped of her royal trappings, relying solely on her wits and the unwavering loyalty of her small band. Then a sudden terrifying encounter occurred, one that became legendary. As they rested in a secluded part of the woods, a group of armed robbers, hardened by the lawlessness of the times, stumbled upon them. These were not soldiers, but desperate men looking for plunder. For a moment, Margaret and her son were in even greater peril than from the pursuing Yorkists. The robbers, seeing richly dressed figures even in their disheveled state, likely smelled an easy target, unaware of the true identity of their quarry. It was a moment of supreme danger. Margaret, with her characteristic bravery, somehow managed to negotiate with the robbers. The historical accounts vary. Some say she appealed to their sense of chivalry. Others, that she offered a large reward, promising future riches if they helped her. One story tells of her dramatic plea, revealing her identity and entrusting her son, the future king, to their protection. Miraculously, one of the robbers, perhaps moved by her plight or by the promise of future reward, recognized the gravity of the situation. He agreed to protect them. This was a truly miraculous turn of events. To escape the immediate danger of battle, and then to fall into the hands of bandits, only to convince one to become an unlikely ally, was a twist of fate bordering on the incredible. The robber, now their protector, guided them through the treacherous landscape, using his knowledge of the local trails and hidden paths. They continued their desperate journey, eventually making their way towards the coast, their ultimate goal to escape England entirely. They eventually found a loyal Lancastrian sympathizer who provided them with passage on a small ship. The journey across the North Sea to Scotland was another perilous venture, but they had cheated death once again. Margaret's Hexham hideaway was a testament to her unyielding will to survive and protect her son. She had faced down an enemy army, endured the hardships of flight, and even convinced a common criminal to become her unlikely guardian. This escape was not just about avoiding capture. It was about ensuring the continuation of her dynasty, however slim the chances seemed. She would spend years in exile, constantly plotting and striving to restore her husband and son to the throne. Though her efforts ultimately failed with the final defeat at Tewkesbury in 1471, her escape from Hexham, particularly the encounter with the robber, became an enduring legend, symbolizing her extraordinary resilience and the incredible turns of fortune in the brutal Wars of the Roses. She had stared into the abyss of defeat and found a way, however desperate, to continue the fight. Number 3. The Empress Adelaide of Burgundy Garda Gambit. The year was approximately 951. Empress Adelaide of Burgundy, a woman of striking beauty and sharp intellect, found herself in the clutches of one of the most ruthless men of her time. She was the widowed Queen of Italy, and her hand in marriage was a prize that could secure the Lombard crown. Berengaria II, the powerful and ambitious Marquess of Ifria, desired not just her territories, but her person. He had abducted her, intending to force her to marry his son, Adalbert, thereby legitimizing his claim to the Italian throne. Adelaide was no ordinary widow. She was the daughter of King Rudolph II of Burgundy, and Bertha of Swabia, and the widow of Lothair II of Italy. Her lineage made her a valuable pawn in the intricate power games of 10th century Europe. She fiercely resisted Berengari's demands, refusing to marry his son, seeing it as an affront to her dignity and a betrayal of her deceased husband's memory. Her refusal infuriated Berengar, who was not accustomed to being denied. In response to her defiance, Berengar imprisoned her in a grim castle on the shores of Lake Garda, likely the fortress of Canossa. This was not a luxurious confinement. It was a harsh incarceration designed to break her spirit. The castle was heavily guarded, its walls thick, its position overlooking the lake, making any escape seem impossible. Adelaide was isolated, cut off from any allies, her fate seemingly sealed by Berengar's iron will. But Adelaide was not one to despair. She was intelligent, resourceful, and possessed an indomitable spirit. She knew that her only hope lay in escape, not in capitulation. Her mind, even in captivity, would have been racing, seeking any weakness in her formidable prison. The details of her escape are dramatic and almost cinematic, passed down through the centuries by chroniclers like Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim. Adelaide, with the help of a loyal chaplain named Martin, began to meticulously plan her flight. Her first challenge was to deceive her guards, to create an opportunity, however fleeting. One account suggests that she managed to burrow a hole through the thick walls of her prison cell, a feat that would have required immense perseverance and secrecy. Perhaps using tools smuggled in by her chaplain, or improvising with whatever small implements she could find, she painstakingly chipped away at the mortar and stone. Day after agonizing day, this would have been an incredibly risky undertaking. Every sound, every loose stone, a potential betrayer. Once the hole was large enough, or if she managed to bypass her immediate guards through a different means, the next step was to get outside the castle entirely. It is believed she either lowered herself down the castle walls at night, or perhaps, with the assistance of loyal servants on the outside who had been secretly contacted, found a way to bypass the main gates. Her chaplain Martin played a crucial role, perhaps diverting attention, providing supplies, or coordinating with outside help. Outside the castle, the landscape was still dangerous. She was in hostile territory, pursued by Berengar's forces. The most famous part of her escape involved the assistance of a humble fisherman. It is said she hid in a fishing boat, disguised in ragged clothes, pretending to be a simple peasant woman. The fisherman, either out of loyalty or compassion, ferried her across the vast expanse of Lake Garda, its dark waters providing cover under the cloak of night. This daring traverse of the lake was fraught with danger, as Berengar's men would have been scouring the shores. Once across the lake, Adelaide continued her desperate flight. She made her way on foot and on horseback, through forests and over mountains, often sleeping rough, relying on the kindness of sympathetic peasants and the guidance of her few loyal companions. She was pursued relentlessly by Berengar's soldiers, who knew the immense value of their escaped prisoner. Her ultimate destination was the castle of Canossa, a powerful stronghold belonging to a loyal vassal, Count Adalbert Atto. This castle was a formidable fortress known for its strong defenses. Reaching it would mean safety. The journey was arduous, filled with narrow escapes and constant vigilance, but Adelaide's determination never wavered. Finally exhausted but triumphant, Adelaide reached Canossa. Count Adalbert Atto welcomed her and offered her sanctuary, immediately preparing his defenses for the inevitable siege from Berengar. True to form, Berengar soon arrived with his army, laying siege to Canossa, but the castle proved impregnable. Adelaide, now safe within the walls of Canossa, took a further audacious step. She sent a desperate plea for help to Otto the Great, the powerful king of Germany, offering her hand in marriage and the crown of Italy in exchange for his intervention. Otto, already a formidable ruler, recognized the opportunity to expand his influence and unite the German and Italian crowns. In 952, Otto marched into Italy, defeated Berengar, and rescued Adelaide. Their marriage cemented the union of the two kingdoms, and Adelaide became Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, a title she would hold with immense dignity and influence. Her escape from Berengar's clutches, a daring flight from a fortified castle across a lake and through hostile lands, was nothing short of miraculous. It allowed her to not only survive, but to ascend to one of the most powerful positions in medieval Europe, playing a pivotal role in the formation of the Holy Roman Empire and ensuring her legacy. Number 2. The Mary Queen of Scots, Loch Leven. The year was 1568, and Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose life was a tragic drama of power, passion, and betrayal, found herself a prisoner in the isolated and forbidding Loch Leven castle. Perched on an island in the middle of a vast, cold Scottish loch, the castle was a natural prison, its thick walls and watery moat making escape seem utterly impossible. Mary had been forced to abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son, James VI, and was held captive by the Protestant lords who despised her Catholic faith and suspected her involvement in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley. Mary was a queen by birth, trained in the sophisticated courts of France, but her reign in Scotland had been a tempest of political intrigue and personal tragedy. Her captivity at Loch Leven, under the strict guardianship of Lady Douglas, the mother of her half-brother and regent, James Stuart, Earl of Moray, was designed to break her spirit and neutralize her threat. She was isolated, constantly monitored, and her every move was scrutinized. Cold, damp castle, surrounded by the bleak waters of the loch, was a stark contrast to the palaces she had known. But Mary was no meek captive. She was a queen of immense charisma and an indomitable will. Despite her circumstances, she had loyal supporters both within the castle and across Scotland, who were desperate to see her freed and restored to her throne. Her beauty and charm were legendary, and even in captivity she managed to inspire devotion. Her first attempt at escape had been thwarted when she was discovered in disguise, attempting to slip out dressed as a laundry-maid. This failure only intensified her resolve and made her captors more vigilant. However, the castle itself, despite its strength, had a weakness. The family of her jailer, Lady Douglas, included sympathetic individuals. Among them were George Douglas, the younger brother of the castle's master, and Willie Douglas, a young page and distant relative of the family. These two individuals, drawn to Mary's cause, became central to her new daring escape plan. The plan was audacious, relying on meticulous timing and incredible luck. It would involve exploiting the unique isolation of Lochleven Castle, using its watery defenses as an escape route rather than a barrier. The critical element was the castle's boat, the only means of transport to and from the island. On the night of May 2, 1568, a thick fog descended over Lochleven, providing a natural veil for their desperate undertaking. Inside the castle, Willie Douglas, who had been entrusted with the keys to the castle gates, made his move. He managed to secure the keys, perhaps by distracting a guard or by a moment of negligence on the part of his unsuspecting kin. With the keys in hand, Willie quietly made his way to Mary's apartments. Mary, along with a few trusted ladies-in-waiting, was ready. They were dressed in simple dark clothing, prepared to blend into the night. Their hearts must have been pounding every creak of the ancient timbers, every distant sound from the sleeping castle, a potential alarm. Willie led them through the silent corridors, past the chambers of sleeping guards, their footsteps muffled by their soft shoes. He unlocked the heavy bolts of the castle's outer gate, its hinges groaning softly in protest. Cold, damp air of the loch washed over them as they stepped out into the misty darkness. Their next challenge was the boat. Willie had already secured the castle's small boat, often kept chained and locked. He had managed to unfasten it and bring it to the shore. Mary and her companions quickly scrambled into the small vessel, their movements quick and practiced. Willie then took the desperate symbolic step of throwing the keys to the castle into the deep waters of the loch, ensuring that their escape could not be immediately reversed, and preventing any immediate pursuit by boat. The splash would have sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness of the night. George Douglas, Mary's other accomplice, was waiting on the distant shore of the loch with horses. Willie rowed with all his might, propelling the small boat across the dark, fog-shrouded waters. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic splash of the oars and the frantic beating of their hearts. They strained their eyes through the thick mist, hoping to discern the opposite shore. Fearing discovery at any moment, the row across the loch was a terrifying gamble. The water was frigid, the current strong, and the fog disorienting. If they were spotted or if the boat capsized, their escape would end in tragedy. But they pressed on, driven by the hope of freedom. After what must have felt like an eternity, the boat scraped against the muddy bank of the mainland. George Douglas and a small group of loyal supporters were there, their horses ready. Mary and her companions disembarked, exhausted but exhilarated. They immediately mounted the waiting horses and galloped away into the darkness, leaving Lochleven Castle and its cold, watery confines behind them. The escape was a triumph of audacity and loyalty. Mary was free, and news of her miraculous escape spread like wildfire. Within days, she had gathered a considerable army of loyal supporters, reigniting the Civil War. Though her ultimate fate would be tragic, leading to further defeat and eventual execution in England, her escape from Lochleven Castle remains one of the most celebrated and daring prison breaks in history. It was a testament to her unbroken spirit and the enduring power of her charisma, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Number 1. The Empress Matilda Winter Wander. The year was 1141, and England was consumed by a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. Empress Matilda, granddaughter of William the Conqueror and claimant to the English throne, found herself trapped in Oxford Castle. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, also claimed the crown, and their rivalry had plunged the kingdom into chaos. Matilda had suffered a devastating setback in London earlier that year, failing to secure the city's support, and now besieged in Oxford. Her very survival was at stake. Matilda was a woman of immense power and royal lineage, having been Empress of the Holy Roman Empire before returning to England to fight for her birthright. But her stern demeanor and perceived arrogance alienated many of her potential supporters. Her position in Oxford was dire. Stephen's forces, led by the king himself, had surrounded the castle, cutting off all supplies. Winter was setting in, and the harsh cold began to bite. Castle garrison was dwindling, food was scarce, and hope was fading. It was only a matter of time before starvation or direct assault would force her surrender. For 3 long months, Matilda and her loyal few held out, enduring the relentless siege. The walls of Oxford Castle offered protection, but also confined them, turning a fortress into a trap. As Christmas approached, the situation became desperate. The river and moat surrounding the castle began to freeze solid, and the snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the land in a stark white silence. Stephen's forces, though suffering from the cold themselves, maintained their grim watch. Matilda, facing certain capture and likely execution, knew she could not wait for surrender. Her indomitable spirit, so often mistaken for pride, now became her greatest asset. She had to escape, and she had to do so in the most impossible conditions imaginable. Her plan was audacious, almost suicidal, but it was her only chance. Escape across the frozen river and through the snow-covered enemy lines. On a moonless night in December, under the cover of a fresh, heavy snowfall, Matilda put her desperate plan into motion. The snow was falling so thickly that it greatly reduced visibility, cloaking the landscape in a shifting white veil. This was both a blessing and a curse. It obscured her movements, but also made navigation incredibly difficult. Matilda, renowned for her elegant attire, now shed her royal garments. She donned simple white clothing, perhaps a plain cloak or even a tunic designed to blend accurate with the snow-covered ground. Some accounts suggest she even wore a shroud-like garment, a symbolic gesture of her desperate gamble, or perhaps a practical disguise. She was accompanied by only 3 or 4 loyal knights, men who had sworn to protect her to the death, and who were as desperate as she was. Their first challenge was to get out of the castle itself, slipping past any remaining guards loyal to Stephen, who might have infiltrated or simply avoiding detection by the weary Lancastrian sentries. Quietly, they descended from the castle walls, perhaps using a rope or a hidden passage, their footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. Then came the most perilous part of the escape, crossing the frozen River Thames, which formed a part of the castle's defenses. The ice was treacherous, thin in places, and the constant risk of falling through into the freezing water was omnipresent. Each step would have been slow, deliberate, and terrifying. The crunch of ice beneath their feet, a chilling sound in the deathly quiet night. They crept across the gleaming, precarious surface, their white clothing blending into the stark landscape, making them almost invisible against the snowy backdrop. Once across the river, they were in the heart of Stephen's encampment. The snow continued to fall, a blessing that obscured their movements from the enemy sentry. They had to move through the lines of sleeping soldiers, past their tents and watchfires, their every movement careful, every breath held. Cold was biting, numbing their fingers and toes, threatening frostbite. The bitter wind whipped around them, making it hard to see and hear. They moved stealthily, using the deep snow as cover, their white disguises proving effective. They were not just escaping a prison, they were escaping an entire army. They slipped past the unsuspecting enemy pickets, relying on the poor visibility and the sentries' desire to shelter from the harsh elements. Their arduous journey continued through the deep snow-covered countryside. They walked for miles through the night, their legs aching, their bodies numb with cold and exhaustion, their breath misting in the frigid air. Destination was Abingdon-on-Thames, a town some 6 miles away where loyal forces were supposed to be waiting. By sheer force of will and incredible luck, they reached Abingdon, utterly spent but miraculously alive. There, they found horses and a loyal escort who quickly whisked Matilda away to the safety of Wallingford Castle, a secure royalist stronghold. Matilda's escape from Oxford Castle was a legendary feat of endurance, courage, and sheer will. It was not just an escape from captivity, but a defiance of death itself, in the face of overwhelming odds and brutal winter conditions. She had survived a months-long siege, traversed a frozen river, and walked through enemy lines, all under the cover of a blinding blizzard, to preserve her life and continue her fight for the English throne. Though she would never truly gain the throne, her escape solidified her reputation as an unyielding and formidable figure, and it remains one of the most astonishing acts of survival in medieval history.